How did the most powerful army in Europe and a century-old republic completely collapse in just a few short weeks? In this documentary, you will witness how an old military doctrine, relying heavily on static trench warfare, was shattered to pieces by a modern and ruthless armored offensive. That heavy silence and false sense of security inside the cold underground corridors of the Maginot Line were completely broken by the dark march of German panzers gliding from the depths of the Ardennes Forest. Step by step, you will observe how the sky-tearing Stuka dive bombers paralyzed the French command system, how the exodus of millions of civilians created an unprecedented logistical chaos on the roads, and how that relentless steel corridor stretched all the way to the English Channel. Following the desperate weight of the trapped soldiers on the foggy beaches of Dunkirk, you will face the heavy boot steps echoing through the deserted boulevards of Paris and the absolute armistice signed in the dim shadows of the Forest of Compiègne. At the end of this dark journey, you will deeply grasp the historical truth of how arrogance and resistance to military innovation brought definitive destruction on the battlefield. If you enjoy our journey through these solemn and dark pages of history, you might consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. We also kindly request you to share your valuable suggestions and thoughts about our documentary in the comments section. Now, we slowly return to that heavy winter slumber that descended upon Europe, to those dark borderlines where the guns fell silent and the approaching storm was hidden by a profound stillness. In the early days of September 1939, the declaration of the Second World War echoed across continental Europe. While the borders of Poland were breached and a massive destruction began in Eastern Europe, a completely different atmosphere emerged on the Western Front. Everyone expected a great, devastating, and bloody storm to break on the horizon. The French and British armies declared mobilization, and trains full of soldiers and ammunition slowly moved toward the border lines. Millions of soldiers settled into trenches dug months in advance along the borders. The barrels of artillery and infantry turned east, aiming toward the German lines. Eyes scanned the horizon behind binoculars in a tense wait, and the soldiers' fingers rested on their triggers. However, that anticipated first order never came. The massive artillery batteries did not fire, and the air forces did not darken the sky. This period of profound inaction, which lasted from September until May 1940, descended upon the border regions like a heavy fog. During these months, which went down in history as the Phony War, only the howl of freezing winter winds and the sound of relentless rain echoed over the forests, rivers, and evacuated towns instead of gunfire. The colossal armies facing each other merely watched the no man's land between them. The dense darkness and fog that descended upon the borders at night completely obscured the vision of both sides. The soldiers only magnified the existence of the steel war machine lurking behind this dark curtain in their minds. This dead silence, initially perceived as a sense of relief by the soldiers at the front during the first weeks, turned into a heavy psychological burden as time progressed. The autumn rains quickly turned the dirt trenches into a sea of mud. The soldiers' boots sank into the water, and their thick uniforms absorbed the dampness. The severe mental wear of waiting for an unseen enemy on the horizon added to these physical hardships. Daily military routines consisted merely of cleaning weapons, waiting for shift changes, and staring at the empty horizon with vacant eyes. This prolonged stagnation on the front line slowly dulled the combat reflexes and attention of the soldiers. The villages along the borders were completely evacuated. The windows of the houses left behind were blacked out with thick curtains, and the streets were abandoned to absolute desolation. From the outside, everything in the region appeared to fall into a deep winter slumber. However, this slumber harbored the suffocating and heavy atmosphere preceding the impending great disaster rather than a peaceful silence. These months, when the guns fell silent and the armies waited, became the darkest and quietest preparation phase of the great fire that would consume Europe. The vast majority of the French army settled into the massive structures of the Maginot Line, which wrapped around the country's eastern border like an impenetrable armor of steel and concrete. Built upon the bloody traumas of the First World War, this defensive complex was not an ordinary trench network. It consisted of concrete blocks meters thick, heavy artillery bastions hidden behind hills, and massive underground cities. Tens of thousands of soldiers retreated into these dark corridors, entirely isolated from the outside world, sunlight, and the changing of the seasons. The harsh winter winds blowing across the border and the ceaseless rain never reached these corridors located meters deep. The thick concrete walls kept out not only potential enemy shells, but also the mobile reality of the war itself. This colossal and isolated structure created a deep and numbing sense of false security in the backbone of the entire French army. The air in these underground complexes remained constantly heavy, cold, and damp. The ceaseless, suffocating, and monotonous hum of the giant ventilation motors became the only sound etched into the minds of the soldiers. The smells of machine oil, sweat, and moisture mingled in the narrow corridors, stretching for kilometers. The soldiers conducted endless patrols in these passages, illuminated by dim yellow bulbs. The perception of time gradually vanished inside the tunnels. Night and day merged into one, and the hours lost their meaning. Daily life took shape around quiet hours, spent on triple-tiered iron bunks, monotonous weapon maintenance, and the silent whispers among the soldiers. This stagnant and isolated life beneath the ground erased the gravity of the lethal war machine, preparing just across the border from their minds. A single unshakable thought took root in the minds of the soldiers trapped between the cold walls of the Maginot Line. This line was impassable. It seemed physically impossible for any enemy army to bypass these massive artillery batteries, anti-tank trenches, and insurmountable concrete obstacles. This arrogant sense of security entirely dissolved the state of alertness on the front line. The soldiers completely detached from the ruthless speed and flexible nature of the approaching modern war, transforming into the passive guardians of a gigantic underground bunker. The reality of war evaporated in the dimness of these tunnels. The soldiers believed they stood in absolute safety inside this colossal engineering marvel they built, and surrendered to that heavy, monotonous slumber below the ground. The historic Château de Vincennes, located just outside Paris, formed the nerve center of French military power. Commander-in-Chief Maurice Gamelin maintained full control of the army from between these old and thick stone walls. In the dim, quiet rooms of the chateau, isolated from the outside world, Gamelin clung with unshakable faith to a rigid defensive doctrine left over from the bloody trench warfare of the First World War. New intelligence reports showing that modern warfare accelerated and mechanized units radically changed the battlefield found no resonance in these rooms. Theoretical calculations lasting for days took place over massive maps of Europe spread across wide tables in the headquarters. Every meeting attended by top-level staff officers and every strategic evaluation reached the exact same conclusion. Time solely worked in favor of France and her allies. The French High Command anticipated that Germany's economic resources could not withstand a prolonged war of attrition and a global naval blockade. This theoretical assumption became the most fundamental military law at Vincennes. In line with this unwavering belief, any offensive idea that required taking the initiative on the front and aimed to push toward the enemy was firmly rejected. In Gamelin's mind, pulling soldiers out of safe trenches and marching them toward the enemy's heavy firepower stood as an unnecessary military disaster and an illogical move. Preemptive maneuvers to probe the weak points of the German lines, cross-border tactical raids, or infiltration operations to disrupt the enemy's balance were completely removed from the planning tables. Staying on the defensive, maintaining current positions with millimeter precision, and waiting for the enemy to come and shatter against the impassable concrete obstacles of the Maginot Line became the Army's sole and absolute strategy. This rigid self-confidence and change-resistant defensive mindset at the Vincennes headquarters destroyed all the mobility and flexibility of the massive French army. The staff officers believed so deeply in this flawless theoretical world they constructed that they completely ignored the noise of the real and dynamic war machine preparing just across the border. The military bureaucracy, within its self-created illusion of inaction, handed over the initiative of when and where the war would begin to the enemy with its own hands. During the early months of the war, the German High Command, OKW, turned its eyes to the dusty maps of the First World War while preparing its attack plans. The first operational draft prepared was almost an exact replica of the Schlieffen Plan executed 20 years prior. According to this plan, the German armies aimed to descend into northern France with a broad right flank assault across the plains of the Netherlands and Belgium. However, this predictable and classic design aroused deep doubts in the minds of the staff officers behind the German lines. Reusing the same routes and tactics was exactly the move the Allied armies expected and prepared for. In the military headquarters corridors in Zossen, it became clearly understood that this obsolete plan would bring a long and bloody trench war rather than a decisive and swift victory. The realization that old roads and familiar strategies would not yield a new victory created a quiet but strong unease within the army ranks. Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein, stationed at Army Group A headquarters, approached the maps, transportation lines, and enemy troop deployments from a completely different perspective. He calculated with absolute mathematics that the Allied armies would immediately advance deep into Belgium against a classic attack from the north and concentrate all their weight in this region. Manstein put to paper, in the form of a detailed report, the idea of drawing the enemy north with this anticipated feint while delivering the main and fatal blow through the center. The point he targeted was the Ardennes Forest, covered with dense trees, steep hills, and narrow valleys, which the Allies considered impossible for large armored units and heavy tonnage vehicles to cross. This audacious strategy, named Sichelschnitt, or sickle cut, aimed to breach the enemy lines at their least protected, weakest point and encircle the advancing British-French forces from behind to trap them in a massive ring. Manstein's innovative and risky design met with harsh objections from traditionalist generals. However, after months of persistent correspondence and internal political struggles at headquarters, the plan reached the highest echelon. In February 1940, this cold and ruthless strategy received absolute approval. Immediately following the approval, the colossal German war machine silently restructured itself around this new central axis. Logistical preparations proceeded in absolute and strict secrecy. Convoys carrying hundreds of armored vehicles, artillery batteries, and tens of thousands of soldiers shifted south toward the eastern borders of the Ardennes Forest under the cover of darkness. One of the largest armored division buildups the European continent ever saw was masterfully concealed beneath the trees in the shadows of the Eifel Mountains. The classic maps of the First World War were torn away, and that lethal new route, which would alter the entire course of the war, was definitively drawn. In the early hours of May 10, 1940, that heavy silence that hung over Europe for 8 months suddenly shattered. Before the sun even appeared on the horizon, the deep, suffocating engine roar of hundreds of German warplanes covered the sky. Operation Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, commenced with devastating blows delivered by the German Air Force on Dutch and Belgian airfields, key defense points, and strategic bridges. The outposts on the borderlines awoke to the violent tremors caused by bombs raining from the sky. In the twilight of dawn, specially trained German paratrooper units landed silently to secure the river crossings. Ground troops trampled over the border stones, accompanied by the earth-shattering fire of artillery batteries. That profound inaction of the phony war came to a complete end with the noise of fire, steel, and explosions. The true face of the long-awaited war descended upon the plains of Western Europe with all its weight. When these first major attack reports from the northern borders reached the headquarters in Paris and London, the Allied High Command felt a strange sense of satisfaction rather than panic. The staff officers at the maps saw that the defensive theories and predictions regarding enemy movements they studied for months materialized exactly as expected. The assumption that the German army launched a flanking assault from the north with all its might, remaining faithful to the old plans of the First World War, was accepted as an absolute truth, with no room for objection in the headquarters. Commander-in-Chief Gamelin pointed to the north on the map upon his desk and issued that anticipated critical order. The dial plan emerged from the sluggish gears of military bureaucracy and went into effect swiftly and without hesitation. This flawless delusion in the minds of the Allied command echelon threw the doors of that colossal trap, which would determine the fate of the war, wide open. With the attack order given, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and the most well-equipped, elite motorized divisions of the French army left their safe trenches behind. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers began a resolute march northwards, deep into Belgium, in massive military convoys. Trucks, half-tracks, and light tanks completely filled the roads and crossed the borders. This colossal flood of men and steel advanced rapidly, with the aim of meeting the enemy and engaging in a major pitched battle on the Belgian plains. However, oblivious to the real danger, the Allied armies flowed straight into the very heart of that perfect trap prepared specifically for them. This immense force, amassing toward the north, created an unclosable and fatal military void on the southern flank, just west of the Ardennes region. The Allies disrupted their strategic balance with their own hands and marched toward the impending great catastrophe entirely of their own accord. While the Allied armies flowed north toward that false storm orchestrated on the plains of Belgium, a completely different operation that would seal the fate of the war began inside the deep, dark forests of the south. The massive panzer group under the command of Ewald von Kleist slipped through the steep, rugged borders of the Ardennes Forest, which Allied staff officers deemed physically impossible to cross. Thousands of tanks, heavy artillery batteries, fuel tankers, and military trucks plunged into a dim green tunnel formed by ancient thick-trunked trees. The narrow, winding, muddy dirt roads where sunlight barely reached the ground were crushed beneath steel tracks weighing tons. A giant armored snake slithered through the depths of the forest in a quiet, disciplined, and heavy rhythm. The dense tree canopy successfully trapped both potential enemy gazes from the sky and the immense tremor created by this colossal march within its own darkness. Throughout this massive and relentless march, absolute radio silence was ordered for all German units to preserve the operation's secrecy. Radio operators completely shut down their equipment. Not a single frequency or open-ended signal wave was transmitted into the air. Within this flood of steel, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, only the suffocating growl of heavy engines, the metallic clashing of gear shifts, and the crunch of crushed rocks echoed. The soldiers rode on without speaking, maintaining strict discipline inside the cramped cabins and behind the dusty armor. They drove for hours, focusing solely on the black smoke billowing from the exhaust of the vehicle ahead. Under this strict rule of silence and flawless planning, the borders of Luxembourg were crossed without a single bullet being fired. The rugged, challenging terrains of southern Belgium, cleft by deep valleys, were slowly swallowed by this phantom army that never broke its speed. The armored vanguard units flowed westwards, straight into the heart of France, in a flawless mechanical rhythm, without encountering any serious resistance. A few French reconnaissance planes piercing through the dense morning fog and low cloud layer over the forest spotted this incredible sight in the narrow valleys where the trees thinned. Unable to believe their eyes, the pilots identified the armored convoy, kilometers long, flowing straight from the depths of the forest toward their own borders. These solitary observers in the sky immediately reported this unprecedented threat they encountered to the center via radios. However, these critical warnings reaching the dim rooms in Paris and Vincennes crashed against the unshakable and rigid prejudices of the French staff. The headquarters maintained its belief, to the very end, that it was impossible for such a massive, armored force to cross through there, due to the geographical structure of the Ardennes. The persistent reports of the pilots were dismissed as a mere illusion of observers under the stress of war. Those vital intelligence notes left on the desks were abandoned to be forgotten among thick files. The French High Command did not take the slightest defensive precaution for this route and deployed no support units to the region. Meanwhile, that heavy, dark, and uninterrupted armored march in the depths of the forest continued to approach the border silently, like a steel spear that would bring the end of the Republic. In the late hours of May 12, 1940, massive German armored columns emerging from the steep and dark valleys of the Ardennes Forest silently crossed the French border and reached the eastern banks of the Meuse River in the Sedan region. The French High Command held an unshakable belief that the deep and wide Meuse River was an impassable natural barrier. According to traditional military doctrine, in order to cross this vast water obstacle, the Germans needed to halt their advance, make logistical preparations that would take days, and bring heavy artillery batteries to the front. This theoretical expectation provided a profound sense of relief to the French soldiers stationed in the concrete pillboxes, underground bunkers, and dirt trenches on the western bank of the river. The soldiers took their positions, assuming the enemy would wait on the opposite bank for at least a week. However, the armored units under the command of General Heinz Guderian ruthlessly cast aside all classical rules of warfare to deny the enemy any opportunity to breathe or regroup. Instead of waiting for the cumbersome heavy artillery batteries to arrive from the rear, Guderian called the destructive power of the Luftwaffe directly to the front lines via radio networks. On the morning of May 13th, the hazy and calm air of the Sedan skies suddenly shattered with the deep, suffocating and dark engine roar of hundreds of German bombers. The sky witnessed one of the most intense, ruthless, and flawlessly coordinated aerial assaults the history of warfare ever saw up to that day. The Junkers Ju-87, commonly known as Stuka dive bombers, tore through the cloud layer and entered a near 90-degree vertical dive directly onto the French defensive lines. Wind-driven sirens, specially mounted on the aircraft's landing gear, let out a piercing, blood-curdling shriek that echoed across the earth and sky during the dive, feeling entirely alien to human nature. These mechanical sirens, named the Jericho trumpet, were explicitly designed to drop a psychological terror far greater than a physical bomb into the enemy trenches. These mechanical screams, descending ceaselessly from the sky in mere seconds, inflicted an irreparable trauma upon the minds of the French soldiers waiting in the trenches. This relentless aerial bombardment, which continued without pause for hours, reduced the thick concrete pillboxes, deep underground tunnels, critical communication lines, and supporting artillery positions of the French defensive lines to ruins one by one. The Stukas took the place of the classical heavy artillery missing from the front and obliterated the defensive lines with pinpoint accuracy and a flawless, ruthless hit rate. The earth trembled violently, and a dense layer of smoke, flying debris, and the heavy stench of gunpowder blanketed the air. The chain of command, discipline, and, most importantly, the will to resist of the French troops on the western bank suffered complete paralysis in the face of this unprecedented psychological and physical destruction. The soldiers trapped inside the trenches abandoned their weapons and ammunition, beginning a chaotic, uncontrolled retreat to escape the deafening wail of those deadly sirens and the rain of steel pouring upon them. Toward the evening of that same day, German infantry swiftly crossed the Meuse River on light inflatable boats and makeshift rafts, establishing the first solid bridgeheads on the opposite shore where resistance collapsed. The river line, long considered the most reliable natural shield of the French Republic, fell completely within a few hours, throwing wide open the fatal door through which massive armored armies would pour into the heart of France. The breaching of the Meuse River and the rapid spread of German armor deep into France shook not only the infantry on the front lines, but also the massive French military bureaucracy to its core. That rigid defensive doctrine built upon years of theoretical planning and the static trench warfare of the First World War shattered to pieces in mere days before the ruthless and unstoppable speed of blitzkrieg, or lightning war tactics. The communication network of the French High Command relied on fixed underground telephone lines, motorcycle couriers, telegraphs, and a highly cumbersome bureaucratic chain of approval. Unlike the German forces, who communicated instantly through modern radio systems integrated into tanks and command vehicles, making decisions on the battlefield in seconds, the French headquarters received vital news from the front with a massive time delay. Inside the historic Château de Vincennes, near Paris, and in the dim command centers behind the front lines, staff officers found themselves utterly helpless in executing troop movements over the large maps spread across their tables. By the time an enemy contact report, dispatched from the front lines, bypassed the heavy gears of the sluggish command chain and reached the top-level decision-makers, hours, and sometimes an entire day, passed. Commander-in-Chief Gamelin and the top-ranking generals issued orders for counterattacks, or the establishment of new defensive lines, based on this outdated and completely invalid intelligence reaching their desks. However, by the time these orders reached the front, the targeted bridges, towns, and strategic intersections already lay crushed beneath the tracks of German tanks. The intended defensive lines fell into enemy hands, while the Allied troops ordered to mass for a counter-offensive were already encircled or scattered. This massive and fatal abyss between the real-time, ruthless speed of the battlefield and the slow time perceived by the headquarters completely paralyzed the entire nervous system of the French army. This profound communication collapse and disconnect of information also crippled the ability of local commanders at the front to take the initiative. Bound tightly by strict hierarchical rules, French officers could not act on their own without absolute, written approval from their superiors, failing to react instantly to the rapidly changing conditions of the war. Because decisions to retreat or counterattack could not happen in time, thousands of soldiers became isolated in their current positions. Lateral coordination between units severed, and French divisions fighting side by side remained completely unaware of each other's positions and status. A deep uncertainty first took hold, followed by an unstoppable wave of chaos spreading through the cold and quiet rooms of the headquarters. Long before it suffered physical destruction on the front line, the colossal French army lost its command and control capabilities, rendering it mentally and organizationally out of the war. In this modern motorized war, where even seconds birthed massive military consequences, those sealed orders delayed by hours became the definitive and final document of bankruptcy for the deep-rooted French command doctrine. That massive and bloody breach opened at Sedan forged a narrow yet lethal corridor for the German armored units, stretching westward into the heart of France and, ultimately, to the English Channel. The panzer divisions crossing the Meuse River ruthlessly discarded the most fundamental rule of classical military doctrine, the principle of securing the flanks. Standard procedures such as waiting for the infantry units trailing behind, securing logistical lines, or taking up defensive positions against a potential Allied counterattack from the flanks, were completely ignored amid that relentless speed. Tank commanders pushed their engines to the absolute limit and drove their vehicles westward toward the sea without stopping. Dusty village roads, vast farmlands, and quiet towns were crushed beneath this colossal flood of steel advancing day and night. This unprecedented armored march created a state of complete paralysis deep within the Allied lines. Instead of slowing down, the armored vanguard units swiftly bypassed weak French resistance points or crushed them directly with heavy firepower. Distances expected to take days were covered in mere hours. The most critical logistical centers, arsenals, and transportation hubs of the Allied armies, such as Amiens and Abbeville, fell into the hands of German tanks without any organized or serious resistance shown. While the officers in the French headquarters were still slowly marking Amiens as in danger on their maps, the German armor already left that city far behind and set out toward the next target on the horizon. The tank crews did not sleep for days. They stayed awake inside the cramped and hot cabins, fueled solely by the intense adrenaline brought by the war and a mechanical rhythm. The heavy stench of motor oil inside the vehicles, the gunpowder smoke, and the never-ending suffocating roar of the engines became the sole reality of this relentless race. Even at the highest echelons of the German command structure, this unprecedented, uncontrolled speed provoked great anxiety. Some high-ranking generals issued orders to halt, stating that the tanks went too far, completely detached from their logistical lines, and left their flanks exposed to major Allied attacks. However, driven by their faith in the unshakable momentum they captured, the armored commanders on the field switched off their communication devices or deliberately ignored these strict orders. The tip of the armored spear continued its dark march westward, toward the shores where the salty scent of the sea lingered, leaving colossal destruction and deep military chaos in its wake without losing a fraction of speed. As news of the ruthless and unstoppable advance of the German war machine spread by word of mouth, a profound wave of panic erupted among the French and Belgian civilians behind the front lines. Keeping the bloody memories and destruction of the First World War fresh in their minds, millions of people abandoned their homes without a moment's hesitation to escape the approaching storm of steel. People piled into horse-drawn carriages, bicycles, wheelbarrows, and automobiles with the last few belongings, bedrolls, sacks of food, and valuable documents they could manage to take. Tens of thousands of civilians, unable to find vehicles, poured onto the roads on foot, carrying only heavy packs on their backs and holding the hands of their children. This massive civilian exodus, heading south and west toward regions they deemed safer, quickly created an unprecedented, uncontrolled flood of humanity across the main arteries and narrow village roads of France. Under the unusually scorching heat of May, these convoys stretching for kilometers along dusty roads crawled forward in hunger, thirst, and intense exhaustion. Appearing sporadically in the sky, the aircraft of the German Luftwaffe opened machine gun fire on the roads without distinguishing between civilian and military convoys, or dropped bombs on critical intersections. These aerial attacks turned the congestion on the roads into absolute terror. Panicking horses overturned carriages into ditches, and civilian cars that ran out of fuel or broke down lay abandoned right in the middle of the roads. Families scattered, and personal belongings and suitcases spilled onto the muddy paths. However, The greatest and most fatal impact of this civilian tragedy on the course of the war materialized as it completely eradicated the already weakened military mobility of the Allied armies. Attempting to advance eastward to halt the German armored breakthrough at the front, secure the flanks, or send support to troops in distress, the French and British military convoys collided head-on with this colossal wave of migration flowing in the opposite direction. Transport units carrying trucks, half-tracked armored vehicles, and heavy artillery batteries remained gridlocked on roads entirely choked by abandoned civilian vehicles and exhausted masses of people. The soldiers tried to part the crowd by honking horns, shouting, or firing warning shots into the air, but they found themselves utterly helpless before this massive throng, driven by the fear of death. Motorized divisions, needing to maneuver swiftly and close the breach at the front, shut off their engines for hours, sometimes days, before this impassable wall of flesh formed by their own citizens. Those counter-offensive plans, meticulously drawn over the broad tables of the Vincennes headquarters, could never physically be executed due to this absolute chaos on the roads. With the logistical lines completely gridlocked, vital ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies failed to reach the troops fighting on the front lines. This profound trauma and disorderly flight experienced by the civilian population completely blocked the jugular veins of the Allied armies, literally suffocating a massive military force on its own roads. The unstoppable advance of the German armored spearhead reached its ultimate target on the shores of the English Channel, west of Abbeville, in the late hours of May 20th, 1940. The vanguard panzer units drove the heavy steel tracks of their tanks right up to the deserted beaches and the salty waters of the sea. As the tank commanders gazed across the vast horizon of the sea from their armored turrets, they finalized not merely a military advance, but one of the greatest strategic disasters in European military history. That narrow and fatal steel corridor, starting from the dark depths of the Ardennes Forest and stretching westward for hundreds of kilometers, finally closed. The military bureaucracy, unable to foresee that the breach opened at Sedan, would slice the Allied lines in two like a colossal, ruthless scythe, faced an inevitable end. This strategic maneuver obliterated the geographical and military integrity of the massive Allied army with a single, flawless sword stroke. Advancing north to meet the enemy in the plains of Flanders, and deeper within Belgium and northern France, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, the most elite divisions of the French First Army, and the entirety of the Belgian army, became trapped within a massive military ring. All land connections, logistical bridges, railways, and supply networks linking them to the main French forces gathering around Paris in the south were decisively severed. Nearly 1 million well-equipped Allied soldiers squeezed into that narrow strip of land, with the cold, tempestuous waters of the English Channel behind them, and the relentlessly tightening German armored circle pressing from all other directions. These massive armies trapped in the north no longer had a single safe land route left to receive regular ammunition and food supplies, or to execute a retreat. The desperate orders for breakout operations echoing in the headquarters and the counter-offensive plans remaining only on paper failed to alter that absolute helplessness on the ground. The surrounded soldiers were pushed step by step toward the coastline as their ammunition dwindled and their chains of command slowly unraveled. That innovative offensive plan, drawn over old maps in the dim rooms of the headquarters months prior, materialized with a fatal certainty cleaving the Allied armies right down the middle. The stark reality of the war was felt with its entire weight across these trapped lands. The fate of the armies, and ultimately of the continent, was completely sealed within the steel circle slowly closing upon that narrow coastal strip. As the final days of May arrived, time seemingly slowed down on the western edge of the European continent. The unstoppable advance of the German armor crossed the plains of Flanders and pushed the Allied armies all the way to the cold waters of the English Channel. Not a single piece of land remained for hundreds of thousands of exhausted British and French soldiers to retreat upon. Sleeplessness, profound exhaustion, and intense uncertainty descended upon the foggy beaches of the town of Dunkirk like a heavy gray blanket. The boundless and turbulent sea lay before the soldiers, while the dark smoke, released into the sky by burning towns, stood behind them. However, in this exact moment of absolute despair, an unexpected and profound silence occurred, altering the mechanical rhythm of the war and the course of history. The German High Command issued a strict order to the vanguard panzer divisions to halt their advance at the borders of Dunkirk. The colossal engines of the armored vehicles fell silent, and a strange, solemn stillness, mingling only with the ocean wind, settled over the front line. This dark weight created a narrow window of time where the hope of survival slowly blossomed for hundreds of thousands of trapped soldiers. Immediately following this historic pause, the British Navy launched the most desperate and massive evacuation operation in maritime history under the code name Dynamo. The geographical structure and shallow waters of the Dunkirk coast completely prevented the massive Allied warships from safely approaching the shore. Faced with this massive obstacle, hundreds of wooden fishing boats, civilian sailboats, and small steamships setting out from the southern coasts of England braved the turbulent dark waters and slowly crawled toward the foggy beaches. For days and long nights, despite the perils descending from the sky, the soldiers stepped into the freezing waters of the sea with immense calm and strict discipline. Long lines of men, submerged up to their shoulders in the salty, cold water, waited patiently for hours for a small boat to appear on the horizon. The dark, dense black smoke, rising from the bombed oil depots of the city, completely covered the sky and brought a perpetual twilight to the Dunkirk beaches, even during the day. Beneath that dim and gloomy light, over 330,000 Allied soldiers slowly evacuated from those dark shores to safe havens, accompanied only by the sounds of engines and the howling of the wind. When the German troops finally received the order to advance and descended upon the shore, only a colossal army of military wreckage left to rust in the sea salt, and a deep, echoless silence left by the ships vanishing over the horizon remained on the sands. When that heavy evacuation operation on the beaches of Dunkirk ended, the doors to a much darker fate opened for the rest of France. The loss of the massive armies and elite units in the north created an irreparably huge void in the remaining French defensive capacity in the south. General Maxime Weygand, who replaced Commander-in-Chief Gamelin following his dismissal due to heavy military failures, forged a new plan of resistance with his remaining exhausted divisions and highly limited military equipment. Weygand established a new defensive line stretching from east to west along the Somme and Aisne rivers, which appeared continuous on the map, but completely lacked depth on the battlefield. This front, called the Weygand Line, consisted of makeshift obstacles, shallow dugouts, and weak support points, entirely unlike the unshakable trench networks of the First World War. Because the most well-equipped armored units of the Allied armies were lost in the northern encirclement, the infantry taking positions on this new line waited silently and helplessly against the approaching steel storm without an air umbrella or heavy artillery support. On the morning of June 5th, following a brief period of rest and resupply, the German war machine launched that colossal and ruthless offensive wave southward under the code name Fall Rot, Case Red. The German vanguard units, consisting of hundreds of tanks and motorized infantry, struck the critical junctions of the Maginot Line with absolute ferocity. In the face of the dive bombings raining relentlessly from the sky, and that mechanical power advancing rapidly on land, the makeshift French defensive positions shattered to pieces entirely in a matter of days. The French army, possessing no reserve forces to close the enemy breaches or secure the flanks, experienced a complete mental and physical disintegration on the field as the front line ruptured. The defensive formation swiftly transformed into a chaotic, disorderly retreat. Gliding like ghosts through the scattered remnants of the broken army, the German armor continued its dark, final march directly toward the capital city of Paris and the heart of France without hitting any serious obstacles. With the collapse of the Maginot Line, the final military obstacles on the path of the German armor to the capital vanished completely. That mechanical and merciless roar of the war now reached the historic gates of Paris. The successive catastrophic news arriving from the front created profound panic and an absolute political collapse within the French government headquarters in the capital. On June 10th, government officials, ministers, and top-tier bureaucrats abandoned Paris, taking whatever state archives and personal belongings they could carry, and set out south toward the city of Bordeaux. All decision-making mechanisms of the state entirely dissolved within that heavy and gloomy journey of escape. Meanwhile, a profound and abandoned silence echoed through the streets of the capital. The military command made a final and bitter decision to prevent the historic monuments, wide boulevards, and unique architectural masterpieces built over centuries from turning to ruins under artillery fire and street fighting. Paris was declared an open city, signifying that no military defense would take place, and the city would be surrendered to the enemy without a fight. This decision spared the city from physical destruction, but shook the psychological resilience of a nation to its core. The erected barricades were silently dismantled, armed troops withdrew outside the city, and the streets of Paris transformed into a vast empty stage awaiting the approaching enemy soldiers. With the departure of the government and the withdrawal of the army, the capital of light and culture fell into a heavy surrender under the dark shadow of war. That sturdy political will of the century-old republic, much like the makeshift defensive lines on the front, went completely bankrupt in a mere matter of days before this unprecedented military speed. In the early morning hours of June 14th, 1940, a hazy and cool air dominated the streets of Paris. The city, once one of the most vibrant and crowded capitals of the world, shrouded itself in a deep, heavy, and dead silence that day. The few civilians who locked themselves in their homes and watched outside in fear from behind their curtains heard those rhythmic and mechanical sounds approaching from afar. Shortly after, the gray uniforms of the German infantry and the cold steel hulls of armored vehicles appeared on the wide, historic boulevards of the city. Facing absolutely no military resistance following the declaration of Paris as an open city, the German troops entered the metropolis with the discipline of a victory parade rather than a combat formation. That solid and monotonous sound, produced by the heavy boots of the soldiers, echoed consecutively through the entirely emptied streets and off the stone walls of historic buildings. The German army held a massive military parade along the Champs-Élysées Boulevard to proclaim to the whole world that they reached the heart of France and won an absolute victory. Armored vehicles, horse-mounted cavalry, and infantry columns marching in flawless formation passed slowly beneath the historic Arc de Triomphe, one of the greatest symbols of French military pride. Massive swastika flags draped the key points of the city, the Eiffel Tower, and government buildings. Paris experienced no physical destruction, but submitted entirely in terms of honor and psychological resistance. Those heavy boot steps echoing through the broad boulevards of the capital that morning engraved into history the definitive collapse not just of a city, but of a deeply rooted European balance. The fall of Paris and the irreversible collapse of the army completely deepened the political rift within the French government, taking refuge in Bordeaux. The political will advocating for the continuation of the war from the North African colonies fell in the face of heavy military pressure and despair. On the night of June 16th, Marshal Philippe Pétain, known as a hero of the First World War, took over the duty as the head of the new government. In his first address to the nation, broadcast over the radio, Pétain announced that the war had to end to prevent further annihilation of the army, and formally requested an armistice from the German command. This call for surrender definitively ended the last remaining Allied resistance on the continent. On the German front, this request for surrender stood out not merely as a military victory, but as an opportunity for historical revenge. Adolf Hitler ordered the armistice negotiations to take place not in an ordinary headquarters, but in a specially selected symbolic location. That historic train carriage, where the German Empire accepted defeat and signed the surrender agreement at the end of the First World War in 1918, was specially brought out of the museum where it sat. By Hitler's strict directive, the carriage traveled back to the exact spot where it stood 22 years ago, among the deep and dim shadows of the Forest of Compiègne. On June 22, 1940, the French delegation reached this dark woodland and found the symbol of their past victories standing before them as a revanchist monument. In the silence of the forest, the German officers surrounding that narrow and wooden train carriage carried the absolute arrogance of a historic victory. The French generals silently signed the armistice document, which contained heavy and definitive terms, on the desk inside that carriage. Those dull marks left by the pens upon the paper certified not only the end of the French Third Republic, but also the beginning of a brand new and dark era on the European continent. Immediately after the signing of the agreement, that historic carriage departed for Berlin as a spoil of victory, and the Forest of Compiègne returned to its deep historical silence. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.